I'm Andrew Jarecki, the director and producer of the film.
And I'm Richard Hankin, the editor and co-producer.
We're going to talk a little bit about this project we've been working on for the last, 3.5 years or so, which started out as a film about professional children's birthday party clowns in New York City and evolved into a very different story, obviously.
I figure for lack of anything better to do, we'll take it towards a more serious side right about now.
It was tricky figuring out the beginning. After we realized the film was fundamentally about Arnold and Jesse, we knew that we had to choose something to start that included them.
I don't think that just because there were things in his life that were private and secret and shameful, that means that the father who I knew and the things I knew about him were in any way not real.
The opening credits of the film were something we thought a lot about also. We knew that the home movies that the Friedmans had taken over the years were such an important part of the film that we wanted them to be the centerpiece of the opening titles. But we also wanted to use these titles as a chance to establish the family members firmly at the center of the story, rather than making it a story about a legal case or something less personal.
Well, I'll bet you I'm gonna be a big star. Might win an Oscar, you can't never tell.
I've loved this song for years and I've always been looking for a film to use it in, and when we met the Friedmans, we knew the time was right.
And also I think the song really gives the film a certain quality that is perhaps a little bit less somber, which is important. When you get to know the family, you know that they're, this is a kind of a vaudevillian, crazy family, and it's not all serious business all the time. At the very beginning of the film, Elaine makes this comment about how Arnold liked pictures.
Arnold liked pictures.
And I remember showing the film to Elaine for the first time. Before we took the film to the Sundance Film Festival, we went up to the Berkshires to show it to her. And I had no idea how she was going to react, and she was sitting quite near me on the couch. And so Elaine comes up on the screen, and she sees herself say that line, and she just says out loud, like to no one in particular sitting on the couch,
"We had 3 sons.
I never said that."
David.
And I just thought that was such a classic Elaine line. She sees herself in living color on the movie screen saying something, and her reaction is, "I never said that." And then a few minutes later, she says, another line, and Elaine pipes up and she says, "I never said that either." Well, I think we have to say that Elaine was such an incredible character from the minute that we met her.
Incredibly candid. And I don't think anyone had ever really listened to her before, so she was very happy to do the interview eventually.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a sense that Elaine was just happy that somebody was letting her finish a sentence.
My friends. And my father was great.
Originally, I took David back to the front stoop of his house because I had been working on this clown movie with him for a long time, and we really were never getting to the essence of his family, and I wanted to know what made him tick. And his stories were these very neatly packaged little descriptions of a perfect family. And I thought, well, maybe if I bring him back home to where he grew up, I'll learn more about the story.
He was incredibly proud of his father, and in the first interview just spoke about him in the most glowing terms and expressed this really somewhat shocking hostility towards his mother, which was one of the first clues that there was another story to be told here. We were just wondering where the hostility was coming from.
The kids liked him and he liked kids, but he didn't like spending a lot of time with his wife, so he would teach high school during the day, and then after school he would come home and teach piano lessons and later computer lessons in the house. And that was, of course, more time he didn't have to spend with his wife.
I'm not that anxious to talk about his father.
This is actually a scene from the first interview that I did with Elaine originally after I had spoken to David, and he had said such awful things about his mother all the time and said what an idiot she was and how crazy she was. And it was an elaborate job to get to see Elaine because I had found out that David had been on Candid Camera when he was a kid, which is kind of ironic, and that he had never gotten a copy of the episode of Candid Camera. And so I said that I wanted to speak to his mother, and one day he called me up and he said, well, I know that you want to talk to my mother, and I really want to get a copy of that Candid Camera episode that I was on when I was a kid, so I'll make you a trade. And that was how I ended up getting to go visit Elaine for the first time.
But in the end, he wasn't together with your mom.
He wasn't together with my mom at the end.
And when did they?
This is obviously a really important moment. When David said to me, there's a lot I could tell you, there's some things I don't want to talk about. That was the first moment that I really sensed that there was something specific that David was not telling me.
Well, whatever. There's some things I don't want to talk about.
And there were a lot of these hints that he gave me over time that gave me a sense that there was a deeper story, but this was the first time sitting on the steps that he really got lost in thought for a minute and took me back into something that he didn't want to recall.
We also wanted to do something visually that would indicate we were entering some new territory here in the film, because we're really, shifting gears now.
Well, this is private.
This is the first time that we see any of the home video material that David had sort of had secretly put away over many years. In some ways, this is probably the most personal piece of that material, and it's obvious from what he says.
So turn it off. Don't watch this. This is private.
It makes it difficult to watch it, I think, in a way.
We tried this at one point as the absolute first thing in the film, but we just found after trial and error that it worked better here.
If you're the fucking cops, go fuck yourselves. Go fuck yourselves, because you're full of shit.
Back in 1984...
I found this John McDermott character really interesting. I mean, he's the personification of the giant governmental machine. And it's also a little bit frightening that around the time of the Reagan administration, Ed Meese, who I guess was the Attorney General, had gotten some funding to put together this thing called the Meese Commission, which, among other things, put together a group of these postal inspectors who went prowling for pedophiles.
Determine if he is in fact willing to violate the statute again about mailing or receiving child pornography.
Arnie makes this comment in the note that he sends to the postal inspector, who he assumes is a fellow pedophile. And he says, I'd like you to send me something sort of good faith, and I will forward this rather precious book to you. And I think that's important because it really shows that at the time that Arnold was sending this material, he knew that he was committing a crime. It was a way between pedophiles that they would sort of signal each other that neither one of them was a police officer for the first pedophile to get the second one to send him something as well. Because if it was a police officer, he wouldn't be able to send him a piece of illegal pornography. It shows that Arnold really took a tremendous risk with his own family. And despite David's version of the story in which Arnold is completely blameless, in this at least we know Arnold was clearly guilty. I mean, as the father in a family, the breadwinner, the center of the family, to commit a felony, knowing that you're committing a felony, is really a tremendous decision and a very irresponsible one.
About an hour later, we went back. We gave him some time with the magazine.
It's very interesting that, as we hear from John McDermott, that he had found this pornography that Arnold had sent in the mail. What we don't hear here is that actually John had been working on this case for about 2 years, and back in 1984 they had found this one package from the Netherlands that was addressed to Arnold, but then in order to make the charges stick, and I think they would have had to show that not only did Arnold receive a piece of pornography, but actually that he used the U.S. mail to send one. And so after about 2 years of mailing letters to Arnold, posing as a pedophile, McDermott finally encouraged Arnold to send him a piece of pornography.
The photographs from the search were, something else that was extremely well documented and that we were happy to get our hands on.
The shot you're about to see of Arnold's face is really so remarkable. It's obviously the moment when he realizes that they are really going to search his whole house and that his life and some of his darkest secrets are about to be exposed. And suddenly, I think he felt very violated. Suddenly there are people in his private office. He wouldn't even let Elaine in his private office, and suddenly there's a man nearly twice his size who's saying, I'm going to make you open every drawer. And you just see the vulnerability on Arnold's face here. It's kind of heartbreaking in a way.
That's the proverbial deer caught in the headlights.
But we're still going to search. And he goes, I don't understand why don't you go when I tell you that's all there is. I said, well, we don't believe you.
It's not something he sort of left lying around on the kitchen table.
The issue of where exactly the pornography was in the house and Elaine's knowledge of it is an important one that gets played out later in the film. We thought that she was quite convincing here that she really did not know that this existed in the house.
Cleaned. He says, don't let her clean in here. It's okay. I don't want my things disturbed. So, all right. I never went in there.
Then one of our inspectors moved the piano that was in that office, and that's where his stash of magazines were held, behind the piano.
We thought it was important to show exactly how hardcore and graphic this material was, and that it wasn't, this was a pretty serious charge in and of itself.
On these things, he just wanted to look at these pictures and meditate or.
Well, that line of Elaine's, I have to say, in the context of a relatively serious filmmaking process, that was a very light moment, just Elaine's use of the word meditate, and it became kind of a little test for us.
We always wanted people to have the license to laugh at times that, were appropriate, and we could tell in screenings how people were reacting to that line.
There were definitely screenings where there was absolute laughter and just a sense of the absurdity of that line, but then there were other times when people would just sit somberly through it, and we thought,
dead silence.
That's gonna be
That's
hard
a problem
to manage.
Just when you think.
Oh, this is a great moment, actually. The interview with Fran Galasso, that first interview, and the famous coffee cup.
A lot of people have noticed that, or they want to know who's pictured on the coffee cup, and it's George Bush on one side and Dick Cheney on the other side. And during the shooting, Andrew actually had to point out to Detective Galasso that Dick Cheney was on the other side of the mug. She hadn't noticed that.
Sectioned it off and started sending detectives out to do interviews.
She set us up in teams, female teams, and we got a list of alleged victims.
That line of Tony Squelia's always disturbed me because, at this point in the case, I think all they knew was that they had a list of computer students from the Friedman house. And it was interesting that as soon as he was brought into the case to start interviewing kids, he was told that was a list of alleged victims, which I think, was a certain kind of presumption that's dangerous to make at that stage in the case.
Because the one thing that you worry about, I know I worried about it all the time, is just charging somebody with this kind of a crime is enough to ruin their lives. So you want to make sure that you have enough evidence and that you're convinced that you're making a good charge.
That line of Galasso's has stayed with me a lot because, she really strikes me and struck me at the time as such a rational and clear-thinking person. She can express herself so well, and, she's obviously very cautious in how she describes, the care that she took in making sure she made a good charge. And then it wasn't until later that I started spending more time with her, and I started to see that some of her recollections of the case are not as accurate as they could be, or certainly not borne out by some of the documents and other things that we see.
We rang the doorbell. As soon as he realized who it was, he wasn't going to let us in, so one of the detectives broke the door down.
That line disturbs me also. I have to say that in Arnold's defense, sometimes it's hard to defend Arnold, but I don't understand that conclusion that he saw that there were police outside and he wasn't going to open the door. He certainly has never given any indication that he's the kind of guy who would barricade himself up inside the house. So the idea that the door needed to be broken down of this sort of quiet suburban house with this quiet Jewish family inside getting ready for Thanksgiving, that seemed to me to be a certain kind of zeal that might be unusual.
You could name had arrived on the scene.
I went home for Thanksgiving. Got to the house and there's cops and news trucks all over the place. And I got worried, of course.
When David came to the house, we were able to ascertain eventually the type of business he was in.
I think this is a Fifth Avenue book fair that David was performing at, and I also believe that Jesse was doing the shooting.
I was there when the clown came in. He was ranting and raving.
When Tony Squelia, the detective here, says that line, "I was there when the clown came in. He was ranting and raving." That's got to be one of our
favorites.
He wasn't allowed while we were searching. And finally, he came in for the last time. He bent down. I really thought he had a weapon in the duffel bag. Everybody kind of, reached for a gun at one point.
Now, the footage coming up, we were pretty amazed and happy to find out that it existed.
Yeah, I remember when Frangolosa said that, I thought, well, I wonder what really happened exactly, because, is it really imaginable that David actually put underwear on his head?
There it is.
And I think you called me up after we got the delivery of that footage, and you said, you better come down here and take a look at this.
Lawrence of Arabia, which maybe that would have been better, but I took out underwear and I put it on my head because I didn't want to be on camera.
The news footage really helped us because we, obviously there's no narrator, so we're able to tell pieces of the story with the news footage.
The charges are that while running a computer school, Arnold Friedman and his son engaged in various forms of sexual abuse against minor children.
Jesse pulls up coming home from school. His friends dump him out of the car.
David sort of grabbed me and...
I think this is the first time that we actually see Jesse in the film at all.
And there was a lot of discussion about when the right moment to introduce him would be.
And also there was a sense that, we didn't know whether we wanted to show him, or in what state to show him, because, we had visited him in prison, and then we had interviewed him outside of prison, and so we said, well, we don't want to make it look like he's in prison, so we filmed a whole interview with him, about an 8-hour interview, in whatever outfit he was wearing right after he got out of prison. And then we all looked at the interview and we said, well, he looks like he's in prison. And we said, all right, maybe it's the green sweatshirt. So we changed him into some other outfit and we told him to put on a polo shirt. And then the next time we interviewed him, we did another 8-hour marathon interview with him. And we looked at the footage the next day and we said, well, he decided to put on an orange polo shirt. He still looks like he's in prison. And I think I concluded that, after you've been in prison for 13 years, it just takes a certain amount of time before you spring back into looking like a civilian.
By Jesse. He was by far the more violent one.
All these policemen said that Jesse was some kind of aggressor.
This was kind of a fundamental editing decision, when to bring in the first piece of contradictory material that went against the police in the prosecution case. And we played around with this and probably 50 different variations before we decided on this particular structure. I mean, Judd here is acting as basically a character witness for Jesse.
Yeah, originally we had actually, we had done these elaborate written outlines and sat there and talked through when we would want to introduce the next level of complexity in the case, because it was always like unpeeling this onion. And I think we decided that we would try at first to show the film entirely in the case, entirely from the police perspective. And so the first cuts of the film had 45 minutes of the police version of the story. And what we found was that if you then added in another layer of complexity and another set of people to believe after that, there was no going back. Once you had already done that case for 45 minutes, it was just a kind of an afterthought to say that there was any doubt.
People just didn't hear it.
Yeah, because the case is obviously so shocking and all these charges layered upon other charges, I think people just feel like at a certain point they just get tuned out.
This is the first of several similar looking and feeling transitions. We wanted to give people a little time and space to breathe and get a sense of the Great Neck environment and to digest the material that preceded it. It's obviously a very dense film in terms of the information that you're asked to absorb.
The investigation didn't end at that point. That really was the arrest and the search of the house. And then we went on, because we had literally at that point dozens more interviews to do.
That's a very important point because, obviously Jesse Friedman's position is that the police interviewed 81 different computer students, and 14 of them were alleged to have made statements implicating the Friedmans. And so what happened to the other 67 interviews? And in fact, under the law, the lawyer for the defense, Peter Panero, would have been entitled to this. It's called Brady material, and he would have been entitled to get all of this material, any interviews that might have contradicted the interviews with the 14 children that said something happened. Presumably these other 67 kids said something different, either said nothing happened or something else, and that was something that was never provided to the defense, and so that's something that Panero focuses a lot on.
The lawyer showed me the magazine, and then I saw it for the first time. I really saw it. And I couldn't believe what I saw.
I love when Elaine says this, she says, my eyes were in the right direction, but my brain saw nothing. I think that's such a classic Elaineism, and it's really so true, I think, in terms of the the way our memories work and how memories change over time, that, that we can actually see something before our very eyes and then somehow it's not absorbed if it doesn't fit in with our sense of things. That's something that I think is a theme that comes through for so many people in the film.
Mr. and Mrs. Friedman's house on this most beautiful Thanksgiving dinner.
My daughter for my son-in-law.
Now this is some Super 8 footage that David gave us pretty early on when we were making the clown film, and it wasn't until later, after we realized what the story was and we went back and re-looked at that Super 8 footage, that to realize that we have a Friedman Thanksgiving captured on film was pretty amazing.
Yeah, particularly in light of how important Thanksgiving became in their lives, given the fact that Thanksgiving some years later became the darkest moment in their lives.
And that was a moment in my life I'll never forget.
Howard, I think, was one of the more important interviews because he's, I think, the most emotionally accessible Friedman. He really is, everything's right out there, whereas many of the other characters in the film are much more guarded in regards to what they're feeling.
Yeah, I think Howard has tremendous love for his brother, and I just think that the stories that he was hearing from Arnold about his experiences right after being arrested must have just been really shocking for him.
They're going to kill me. They're going to kill me. Get me out of here.
People versus Arnold Friedman.
This is obviously important because it's the first time that they ever allowed cameras in the courtroom in Nassau County. I guess you could say that this was a fairly risky experiment because, the Friedmans argued to try to get a change of venue in the case. They felt that they couldn't get a fair trial in Nassau County because there was so much publicity about the case, and the judge refused. And then she allowed all these cameras to come into the courtroom, and she approved so many news reporters that could cover the case from the inside of the courtroom, and that's something that may have contributed to the public anger toward the family.
They somehow got one kid they got the police to be able to convince the kids, well, all your friends said something happened. Didn't something happen? Something must have happened, et cetera, et cetera.
Clearly the Friedmans are talking in the film just about some of the most intimate details of their lives. And some people have asked me why they were so open. And I think my approach to that was really just to get to know the family members in a very sincere way and to let them get to know me. I spent a lot of time with the family with and without the camera rolling, and there's no way to make a film that's this personal without really developing a sincere relationship with the subject. And I think that may have given Elaine and other people the sense that it was safe to be that open about these subjects with me.
David plays beautifully, and his father taught him how to play the piano.
Now, this is the first of 3 sections on David that were kind of late in the editing process. We just kind of wanted to get more of a sense of his relationship with his father, where these feelings were coming from, and just more of an idea of what that dynamic was.
Well, clearly, we hear Elaine at various points in her interview sort of acting as if David's desire to be a magician is just the most absurd career choice in the world. And obviously it's something that David loved very much, and it's been such a huge part of his life. So the fact that his mother sort of said, well, anything but that, be a doctor or be a lawyer, but don't do this, don't be a magician. And yet Arnold accepted him completely. Arnold was a mambo musician when he wasn't being a teacher. And I think he really had that in common with David, that desire to be a showman, to have this alternative personality, have a whole different life. David performs as a clown and, changed his name and has this performing persona that's completely different. And I think in a way, so did Arnold. He had changed his name to Arnito Ray and gone to the furthest possible point from what he really was, which was a, kind of nerdy teacher. Suddenly he was a band leader with a Latin name.
All you heard were accolades about this person, and now all of a sudden, he's a monster.
We were lucky to work with a really talented cinematographer on this film, Adolfo Doring, and he brought some looks to the project that really, jibed with the storytelling, one of which is this idea of starting a shot and deeply out of focus and then slowly bringing the shot into focus. which really jibed with, this technique of trying to shed light on some of these very complicated matters.
And also the idea of memory. We had people who were sort of in the process of trying to focus their own memories and trying to convey these thoughts that, in a way, had gotten very blurry over time, so that it sort of mirrored that, too.
We wanted to give a sense of what the Great Neck community was like, just where this drama was all playing out, and Adolfo did an amazing job with these shots. You really get a feel for the place.
I was very fixated on sprinklers, I have to say. I kept, making the people in the houses turn them on. We were running around the lawns. Eventually we made everybody turn on sprinklers at the same time, because we just felt like this idyllic community that was constantly being washed by sprinklers was somehow a metaphor for the community's desire to get anything unclean out of its midst.
Most of the children...
Now here's where the prosecution really starts to lay out their case as they would have if this had gone to trial, kind of taking you through it step by step in terms of what was going on and how they said that it escalated.
If you were going to be
the computer games are interesting. We knew that a few computer games had been found in the collection of discs that were found at the Friedman house, and we wanted to be able to show that. And so we found that there were simulator sites on the internet where you could get Commodore 64 games in their original form. And so we had somebody who was smart about those games, and we had somebody basically kind of reconstruct those original Commodore 64 games so we could show them.
So were the kids abused in the computer room in view of everyone else?
From what I saw in my sessions, none were raped out on the floor.
A lot of people have asked us about the posture of this interviewee.
Well, we didn't put him in that position. We put him in the normal position, or we said, where do you want to sit? And he sat upright at first. And then over the course of the few minutes of the beginning of the interview, he slid down into that reclining posture. And then a few times we suggested he sit back up straight, and he always felt more comfortable in that position. So we ended up just shooting him that way.
Because of that, I was raped by him and Jesse at the same time as punishment to that. I never did it again. He made me format it. I formatted it. I had to bring my computer and show him. Then I had brought it home. So he was absolutely positive 100% that it was not touched at all, any way, form, shape whatsoever.
And how did he know that you brought it home?
That pause before he answers the question always seemed to be kind of interesting in its length.
Tell me now or I'm going to kill you all. And he had a knife, and he was waving a knife around.
This is the first time that anybody, for example, has ever alleged that Arnold Friedman had threatened them with a knife. There was a certain extreme quality to that student's recollections.
The types of behaviors which were described, which were, just downright satanic in nature. I mean, they make him sound like some kind of brutal sadist.
Ron's interview was really important because here was a computer student that was willing to go on camera, not in silhouette, and say that he never saw anything unusual happen.
There were a number of these interviews, for example, people that would agree to speak to me on the telephone, but, either hadn't yet thought it through enough or, weren't sure that they wanted to appear on camera. But Ron was very clear that, he wanted to express himself and didn't have anything to be ashamed of.
It was just generally a free-for-all.
In the beginning, when there was the first indictment against Arnold and Jesse, the charges were pretty light, particularly for Jesse. And increasingly, I think, as it looked more likely that the Friedmans would plan on going to trial, the charges became much more extreme. And so you have some of these charges that begin to resemble some of these kind of late 80s sex cases where you have what they call multi-victim, multi-perpetrator scenarios where you have, adults playing games with the children or kind of versions of games that become sexualized.
It seems almost like some kind of grotesque fantasy.
Yeah, leapfrog. I remember about that.
I spoke to a friend of mine who was an expert on analyzing witness testimony, and he found this very interesting because he said that there was this sense that when this boy says leapfrog, I remember about that perhaps he was remembering something that had been told to him rather than remembering something that had happened, because if somebody wants to say I remember that, then that's how you say that. You don't say I remember about that.
It's not considered molestation, was done outside, but that was a group game. the actual molestation, one-on-one contact happened in the bathroom. The game happened out on the floor.
This was just one of many contradictions in this interview. He's describing something what seems to clearly be sodomy, but then when asked further about it, he says, no, it was just a game. It was not considered molestation.
But, you know, that wasn't my province. That wasn't what I had to decide.
Scott Banks was one of the first people that I met when I went to the courthouse to kind of understand where the judge was and where the trial would have happened. And Scott was her law secretary at the time. He was a very important part of her process. My opinion is that he was very disturbed by this case. And he said to me at one point that he had left the judge shortly after this and gone off to take his next job, and that partly it was the fact that he and the judge had divergent opinions on how this case should have been handled.
The secretary used to tease me that we were the pervert part, and having been, head of the sex crimes unit myself, where, I had young boys who were sodomized, in fact, one who killed himself.
I always thought it was interesting that Judge Bachlan used to be the head of the sex crimes unit. It's earlier in her career where she was coming from.
I mean, this was really very, very bad, what was going on there.
I was also interested in the judge's remark that there was never a doubt in my mind as to their guilt, because that always struck me as unusual given the fact that she was never able to see a trial in the case, and so she never saw any conflicting evidence.
It was hard for me to believe that it was true.
We now welcome, also in Los Angeles, Debbie Nathan. Debbie is an investigative freelance journalist who has been covering the McMartin and other abuse trials around the country. All these parents are bizarro, huh? They're all whacked.
Debbie functions as kind of a quote-unquote expert in the film, although we did limit the interviews to people who had first-hand knowledge of the case or the family, and Debbie luckily knew the family, so we were able to use her in that way.
Also, she serves as a kind of a proxy for Arnold, because Arnold doesn't really have his voice represented in the film, but he wrote a great deal, and so even though he was he had passed away by the time we started making the film, we had a chance to convey many of Arnold's feelings and thoughts and things that he had written in his document called My Story by having Debbie read those things. So she became kind of the voice of Arnold, and she was a person who had received a lot of letters from Arnold and had contact with him, so she functioned less as an expert on things like sexual abuse and more as an expert on Arnold.
And here she is kind of taking their defense to the next level, whereas Judd was more of a character witness. She is offering what would be akin to expert testimony had there been a trial.
There was more testimony. There was a dearth of physical evidence. I don't even recall whether there was any physical evidence that would have indicated one way or another that these events took place.
It's a key question, was there any physical evidence in the case? Because many people have asked that after screenings. They just can't believe with the alleged charges that there would not be.
Joe Honorato always struck me as being a fairly straightforward guy. He would periodically call me up while we were making the film and say, hey, have you thought about this, or have you spoken to this person? And I gave him a lot of credit for being willing to appear in the film. I think a lot of what he says actually raises some question about certain aspects of the investigation. And, although I think today he's very adamant that the prosecution was handled properly.
There were literally foot-high stacks of pornography in plain view all around the house.
Fran Galasso's recollection of the pornography in the house, which was limited to the relatively small stash of magazines in Arnold's office, but she remembers as foot-high stacks of pornography in plain view all around the house, is just the kind of memory that I think is explored in this film. This is a memory which obviously is not borne out by the facts. The search warrant returns, the inventories that her detectives took, the photographs, none of that indicates that there were these foot-high stacks of pornography, and yet to this day she maintains that they existed.
And once you see the photographs and learn that there were not these foot-high stacks, I think a lot of people wonder if she's a reliable source of information, and you kind of have to reevaluate what's come before in the film.
If you're not victimized, you don't fit into that community.
The families that had their child molested or allegedly molested became very involved.
His father, who we see in shadow here, is very important. He was the first parent who agreed to be in the film. The Great Neck community is this very insular community, as Elaine tells us, and even to this day, the parents, many of them don't want to talk about something like this. Even if they're not sure what they think, they realize that there's a lot of pressure to not come forward. That father, for example, was told by another parent who he's friends with that they thought it would be very inappropriate for him to make any remarks, and so he was reluctant to appear on camera.
One of our goals and the way that we wanted to portray the family was really in a very human way. When you have a case like this, there's a tendency in the media for the family to become very dehumanized. I also think that the Friedmans felt that if they shared all their private material with us, including all this home video material, it's true that some people would say, oh, those guys are crazy for videotaping everything, but you really couldn't get through this material and not think of this family as a group of human beings, flawed human beings, but very real. There's a tendency in a case like this to characterize the people that you're reading about in the newspaper as monsters. And I think once we call someone a monster, we don't really learn anything about them anymore. It's sort of, they're obviously a whole different species from us. And so it was important for us that we really show the humanity of this family, the fragility of the family.
Destroyed my family. Tore us apart.
I don't know. I can't say too much about it. We were a family.
This is part of that first early interview that I did with Elaine before I knew the full story of the family. At the time, I was still making the movie about clowns. And when she said that to me, we were a family, I remember thinking, that was such a sad line. And here we had this woman who was in her 70s who had obviously spent her whole life building this family, raising this family, and here she was talking about it in the past tense, as if it no longer existed. And it really made me feel like I had to go out and find out what happened to this family.
This is the first time we really settle into the Friedman home video material, and it kind of takes the film to another level of intimacy. It's like this fly on the wall kind of footage that I had never seen anything like it before.
We didn't know this footage existed when we first started, well, obviously working on the clown movie, but then eventually when we started working on the movie about the Friedmans, we didn't know it existed. And it wasn't until I'd spent a bunch of time with David and eventually told him that we had discovered this other story, this secret story of his, and that we were going to refocus the film and make it about that he sort of agonized over it and eventually said, well, I don't know if I want you to make that film or not, but I have to tell you, if you're thinking about it, that in addition to all the home movie footage that my father took and all the material I gave you before that shows the family during happy times, there's another 25 hours of home video footage that I started taking after the police showed up at my house.
At some point, David making the videotapes kind of springboarded to my thoughts about audio tape.
Here Jesse's talking about having made audio tapes of the family. I mean, this is so unusual, and I understand what was going on to some extent, because it's clear that Arnold knew certain things about his own transgressions that he had never shared with Jesse, and probably had shared some more with Elaine after the issues in the case broke. And I think Jesse never felt like he was getting a completely straight story from his father. And so I sort of understand why, when Jesse heard his father and his mother arguing behind the door in their bedroom, why he put a little Radio Shack tape recorder right up to the door to try to record it and try to understand a little bit better what Arnold might have been saying to Elaine, since obviously it was going to have a tremendous impact on Jesse's life as well.
And in a way, this audio material is much more raw than the videos, because really nobody knew that it was being recorded at the time except Jesse.
I said, I don't know. And I didn't, they wanted me just to lie, and say he didn't do it, whether I believed it or not.
Elaine is a very polarizing character in the film, and I've heard stories about husbands and wives leaving the theater, going out into the parking lot and calmly talking to each other, and then suddenly they burst out in some argument, and usually it seems to be about Elaine. The husband will say, well, I thought that mother was really difficult, or she was awful, and then the wife will say, no, the woman was the only thing that held the family together, and so there seems to be a real range of opinions about Elaine and her role in the family.
You spent 6 weeks in jail for it. You're trying to build a defense and your wife leaves you, essentially. My father fell apart.
With so much material, particularly audio material, that couldn't find its way into the finished film, that we wanted to share, and so many photographs of the family that we built the website for the film, which is called capturingthefriedmans.com, essentially as a kind of a photo album about the family in which all the photos speak in some recorded way. And it's something that has really been important in terms of people absorbing the film, partly because it's just not, it's not a promotional website. You can't buy a T-shirt there or anything, but it's just another piece of art about the family. It's another experience with the family.
Yeah, but if let's say he goes away for 10 years, he's still going to come out. No, I'm talking about 50 years. I'm talking about 100 years. Well, she doesn't think he's getting 50 years.
This is fairly typical, the Friedmans arguing, the boys arguing about what's going to happen to Arnold or about what Arnold may or may not have done, and Arnold essentially sitting or standing in silence, which is what you see here again.
This was another moment where we just wanted to open up a little bit of breathing space because we thought that was really one of the more powerful points in their home videos.
We were trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in terms of having dinner and paying the bills, but it was almost surreal.
When David's filming him in the house, Arnold says, "I feel like I'm being dissected here." And I think in some ways that the whole film is about that, the feeling that the kids are trying to dissect Arnold, that Elaine is trying to dissect Arnold, that Arnold is this mysterious, swamp creature who everybody's trying to get a read on. And he's pretty slippery. I mean, ultimately, it's very hard to figure out what was going on in Arnold's mind all that time, particularly with him being so quiet all the time. So it's not a surprise that he's very uncomfortable with the idea of being dissected bit by bit.
I feel like I'm being dissected here. And here's Mommy and Daddy in a rare moment of affection.
Elaine so often says that, she and Arnold had this loveless marriage, sort of. She says at one point when I was talking to her, she said, well, he never hugged me and he never kissed me and he never told me that he loved me. And then here you see this moment of tenderness between them, and then we see all this footage of the newlyweds, and in fact how affectionate they were. Whether Arnold's feelings for Elaine were sexual feelings or were just feelings of affection, obviously they did have an affectionate relationship. They had a functional relationship. They obviously were intimate with each other in some way and knew each other quite well.
So he says, well, all right. Big mistake.
This song, which is called "You're the One," is another classic song by Arnito Rey and his orchestra. So we thought it was appropriate to put it here under the footage of the newlywed Arnold and Elaine.
My mother is sexually ignorant. As far as I'm concerned, she had sex. Everyone thinks their parents only had sex 3 times, for each of the siblings. But with my mother, I think it was true.
Here we have David speaking for his mother again, talking about how sexually immature she is. But, we don't really see that in how Elaine represents herself. She's quite articulate about it. She obviously says that they had this active life, that they had an intimate life. She says it didn't work very well, but that it certainly existed. And if there's any sexual dysfunction here, it's hard to imagine that Elaine was the primary culprit.
And he treated it like work. Like this is what you're supposed to do when you do it, like washing the dishes. And
one of the challenges of the post-production was integrating a lot of different types of visual materials. We were kind of blessed with all this archival material. We had the Super 8 footage that Arnold shot. We had the VHS footage that David had shot, and then archival news footage. So we spent quite a bit of time trying to integrate all of these things into a look that would flow together and aid the storytelling.
It was a difficult marriage because of Elaine.
I always love that line of Howard's. It's the sentence with the surprise ending.
Howard here joins up with David in the Elaine Haters Club, and I don't think either one of them really hates Elaine. I think Howard has some warm feelings toward Elaine, and I remember watching them at the Sundance Film Festival, and Howard saying that he was really moved by having seen the film and had a lot of memories, and that he had sort of befriended Elaine again. Howard said that he had always felt that Elaine was negative to him because of his being gay, and that when they got to Sundance and Howard was there with his partner Jack and Elaine kind of embraced them, I think he felt like there was a chance for them to have a relationship.
And I wasn't the most well-balanced person myself, you know.
I think Elaine's facial expressions are just one of the unsung, masterful elements of the Friedman family. She can express so much in just 3 faces. And she knows it, you know, she realizes she doesn't have to actually say anything to express her point.
It always interested me in this piece of footage that Jesse has to ask 3 times before he's recognized.
What is it, Dad?
Holy shit.
Dad, what is it?
God, it's amazing. How do you do
He's just totally ignored, you know.
Who took it?
My father.
Dad, what's that a film of?
This is a film of my sister.
He's got sort of classic middle child syndrome, even though he's the youngest.
Now this piece of footage was just kind of one of the many treasures that fell into our lap during the course of making this film. I still can't quite believe that it exists.
It's like this piece of footage just traveled through time. You know, it was taken by Arnold's father so many years ago, and then that very same piece of 8mm film managed to find its way from that rooftop all the way into Arnold's hands, and then eventually was passed on to David and then to us.
Sudden death.
And it destroyed the family. Arnold's parents divorced.
Really gives you a sense of the power of Super 8. You know, that these home movies are so evocative. You know, I know nowadays they're having conventions now of people's home movies, and you know the reality is that tiny little format really conveys something so beautiful if you're shooting the right way and the right things.
And it holds up amazingly. I mean, that stuff is old and it's just incredible looking.
And rather than put apparently the living room.
So now we learned some information about Arnold's childhood to try to understand and on some level where he was coming from.
Man into the apartment, and they would have sex in the bed while Arnold was there listening. And Arnold said that because he saw
this moment, I think, of Arnold always resonated with me, because it's just sort of this image of this young boy who was obviously so different than everyone else around him, and obviously was trying to fit in and wasn't finding his way. You know, he didn't have a lot of the normal reactions and feelings of a boy of his age. You know, and then when he finally tells his story, it's almost as if ever since he was that little boy, just sort of walking back and forth in front of the camera, you know, he's never had a chance to really tell what he was really thinking, what he was really about, what kind of person he was.
He says, when I reached adolescence, I sought out partners for my emerging sexuality. My first partner when I was 13 was my 8-year-old brother. I had overt sexual relations with him over a period of a few years.
I know that my brother has said that he messed around with me when I was a kid, and I don't remember any of it. I don't remember anything.
It's another moment in terms of the theme of memory in the film and how different people remember things in such complicated and divergent ways.
Howard says I have nothing up here that has me yelling or screaming or running, and it strikes me that while I don't know what the dynamic would have been between an 8-year-old boy and his 13-year-old brother who were having this intimate contact, I have to believe that it didn't involve things like yelling or screaming or crying. It must have been some other kind of relationship. And so I always have the feeling that Howard is searching, but he's using the wrong search criteria.
A normal situation, as probably happened with my partners, would have been to outgrow and forget these episodes. However, I literally fell in love with these boys, and the relations were far more significant to me than they were to my partners. And then he told me that when he got to be an older teenager...
It's obviously a very important issue, this question of whether Arnold had molested his own children. And there are people that see the film and feel strongly that must have happened, and other people that have different opinions.
And then after he had his own children, he was worried. He started worrying that maybe he would molest his own children.
I think it's impossible to know whether that happened or not, but I do think it's important that Arnold said he was worried about it. It obviously wasn't out of the question for Arnold. He did express some concern about it.
This is one of my, favorite moments in the film where we're immersed in kind of these very intimate details of his sexual history, and then, thrown into this very different tone and scene of him just having a great time with his sons.
The music that they're listening to is one of the great Arnito Rey classics that Arnold and his band performed in his mambo orchestra.
There were a number of other songs that we couldn't fit into the film. One was called the Yiddish Mambo.
I think this connection between, this middle-aged Jewish guy and his mambo music is really fascinating. It probably played out nicely at Grossinger's in the Catskills where he used to perform.
Also in that scene, Jesse calls Arnold Light Fingers, which was his nickname when he was playing the piano in those bands.
What might it be like to grow up in a household like this? I don't know. I can't even imagine.
While we were going through the editing process, Richard and I went back and forth so many times on issues of balance. I would feel one week, having just done a bunch of work and feeling very sympathetic toward Jesse that week. I would say, well, what about this cut? And, do we think we're being too hard on him here? And then Richard would argue that for a while. And ultimately, I think, we tried to reach a balance where we were not advocating a position, but we were trying to let everybody speak their mind. A big part of that was doing test screenings for small groups of people. We did a number of those in New York. When I was living in Rome, we did a number of those in Rome. I found, some good English speakers in Rome who were so disconnected from the whole idea of a story like this that they were great to show it to because they just didn't bring any baggage to it at all.
What did that one guy say after
He said, we all want to know what is the true. There's a real American sensibility to the kind of anger over this sort of case. This tends to be a somewhat more American phenomenon that a whole community can motivate in this way.
People told me, oh, why don't you leave him? He's a horrible person. Just walk out and leave him. And I didn't.
There's a lot of discussion about, certainly by the boys, that Elaine had ignored Arnold and forgotten about him and that she didn't care about him. But it's clear from what she says and other information that she really did make a significant effort to raise money for Arnold's bail, and she describes throwing herself on the pavement in front of her uncle to try to raise bail money for Arnold.
Toast today being here next year. Not your toast?
Or even next month.
I think the Seder all told ran for about 3 hours. So it was quite an experience to view it for the first time.
And this is probably the clearest example of, the camera literally having a seat at the table in the Friedman house. The fact that it was just ever present, and really the only person that objected to it being there was Elaine. And of course Seth, who really never wanted to be on camera, but Elaine is the only one who actively objects to it being there.
I think at one point in the Seder footage, Elaine objected to David having the camera at the, set up by the table, so when she wasn't looking, he just put a piece of black tape over the blinking red record light, and then she thought that the camera was turned off.
He wasn't approached by the police, or maybe he was, but he didn't join up with the police.
I've kidded David about this and asked him to kind of look at this scene and just pointed out to him that he really doesn't listen for his dad's response.
If something happened, Dad? So then nothing happened.
He just doesn't even leave a space for his father to even answer the question. And, David's response was, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, you don't think I was interested in his response. And there is a feeling that Arnold is so quiet all the time and that to some extent nobody's even asking him to explain himself. I'm sure there's a sense on the part of the boys that some of the things that Arnold might tell them are things that they don't want to hear and that don't comport with their feelings about their father. And so that's probably one of the reasons why David doesn't wait to hear whether Arnold has anything to say.
Not that I wanted that to be the case, but you have to find a way to explain the unexplainable.
Well, I think all of this home video footage, is kind of indicative of the fact that, the family enjoyed in some way this tortured process through which they would interact with each other. There was some sense that that this is how they did it. This is how they operated. They would argue endlessly, and I think often maybe lose sight of the most important things. There's actually a discussion on one of the audio tapes with Marty Berenberg, the family psychologist, who's kind of the therapist who's trying to help them get through some of these things. And they're just arguing endlessly, sort of like you see at some points in this Seder. And they're at one point in just fever pitch, and Berenberg says, stop arguing for a second. I want you all to ask yourself, you endlessly argue like this. I want you to ask yourself, 6 months from now when Jesse's probably in jail, can each of you look back on this and say that, you spent this time wisely, that you did your best to try to save your brother? And there's this long pause, like everybody feels very appropriately scolded, and they realize that, they should be thinking about this. And then, of course,
2 minutes later.
Right, somebody just immediately argues with someone else, and the whole thing explodes again, and nobody ever goes back and remembers that maybe they were missing the point.
I never felt angry at my dad. My dad had nothing to do with this.
And that has to be one of the most remarkable lines, David's view that his father had nothing to do with this. I think even Jesse at this point, after the movies come out and Jesse is responding to questions about the film, he's finally saying that, while he may not have been aware of certain things that were happening at the time, he certainly understands the possibility that his father was not blameless, and that in fact, were it not for his father's decision to mail the pornography to begin with, or to order that first piece of pornography, obviously none of this would have come to pass.
Do you object to my handling? Do you have any objection in my relationship with you?
Do you like it when she calls you slime?
She doesn't call me slime.
She did. Did you like it when she did?
Not that one.
Well, I think that this whole Seder is just an example of the unique access that we have into this family through the home videos. And it wasn't until we sat down with David to watch those home videos that he had even seen them himself. In fact, David had recorded all that home video material and taken the tapes out of the camera and put them in a box and never watched them, not even once. I think it was painful for him to watch them with us, but we wanted to go through them together and talk to him about what material we planned to use. We weren't going to let him control what we planned to use, and we weren't going to let him edit material, but we did want to go through it with him. And it was clear that it was a very personal experience, and it was, I think, very emotional. We did it all in one weekend, I guess.
A very long weekend.
Yeah, I think we went through a lot of jugs of ice cream, and everybody had a lot to think about that weekend.
All start brand new. We're all starting brand new. We have a decision-making process on the table. It's clear. All the past mistakes, they were mistakes. We're not going to hold them against anyone.
Great. Now we're starting afresh.
There were many other scenes from this Seder that were in early cuts of the film that we just couldn't keep in the final version, but there's some amazing discussions about voting versus, consensus decision-making, and just many other examples of how this family functioned.
For me, the clock was always a really powerful image of Great Neck, because there is a sense of these families who are living in Great Neck, these upwardly mobile families who are constantly on the clock, constantly trying to get ahead, constantly making their trains. The idea that there's this community that's rushing into the city and working away and getting money and coming back to this upwardly mobile suburb, and that everybody's got something important to do, and nobody wants anything to interfere with that. And while that's the background, I think, we're watching the destruction of a number of lives. We're certainly watching Jesse move closer and closer to what will probably be the end of his life as he knows it. And yet the trains are still running, and people are still moving back and forth, and the Friedmans to some extent become kind of an annoyance to the community, something that can cause, nothing but negative attention to the community.
My father pleads guilty, and then I go to trial.
But there's this feeling of the rest of the world rushing by as the Friedmans are sort of in slow motion moving toward their destruction.
I arranged for Mr. Friedman and his family to get a jury room where they could sit and they could discuss these plea options.
We really wanted to try to understand what went into the decision for Arnold to plead guilty because, first looking at that, it's so confusing, but the family did describe it pretty clearly, and there are many discussions about it in the videotapes and the audio tapes.
I screamed, "You must do it because it'll help Jesse. Do it for Jesse."
There was a writer called Alvin Besant who wrote an article in Newsday, which was a cover story that really just was devastating. It was just such a negative article about the Friedmans, and I think assumed that a lot of the things that the police had said that later turned out not to be true were facts. And recently he wrote another article in Newsday saying that he had been postponing watching the movie Capturing the Friedmans because he didn't know how he felt about it, and finally he had seen it, and that he was more convinced than ever that he was right about the Friedmans' guilt, and that the reason for that is because Arnold didn't protest his treatment strongly enough, that Arnold wasn't vocal enough about saying that he was innocent. And I think that scene in the jury room is one of the few chances we get to sense some of the anxiety that Arnold was going through, because he was clearly extremely tortured by this, and he has panic attacks, and there's some screaming fits, and a lot of that is captured on the audio tape, and we certainly tried to convey that, but Arnold absolutely did not want to walk in there and plead guilty, and he agonized over it.
I want you to be my daddy. And I would have been really, really proud of him if he had just stood up and said, "Elaine, I'm not pleading guilty, we're going to trial." But that's not what happened.
Former New York City school teacher Arnold Friedman had nothing to say when he left the Nassau County Courthouse in Mineola, but inside he pleaded guilty to more than 40 counts of sodomy, sexual abuse, and endangering the welfare of a child.
It's very unusual that Arnold would have been allowed to just go to his what's called his allocution or his guilty plea and simply say yes, yes, yes. Normally they make you describe the crimes that you're convicted of, and Arnold, I guess, made it a condition of his plea that he didn't want to have to say those words, and that all he would do is to respond to the judge's question. And so the way they handled it was that the judge would read from the indictment and would say, for example, did you in fact put your penis against the anus of this child, and did you in fact do X, Y, and Z? And he would say yes.
This isn't my brother. He's not a monster. He's a good, loving brother and husband and son and citizen and teacher, and this isn't happening. This is a mistake. Something as horrendous as child molestation. You have to live with yourself. If you didn't do it, you don't plead guilty. I never understood it.
This, I think, is one of the more interesting pieces from their video archive. I mean, this is the eve before Arnold is going to prison for 10 to 30 years, and this is how they're passing their time.
Well, they're sort of doing, someone asked me if we cut that together and we made them do that, and I said, no, that was one of their favorite things to do, was to put together, footage of themselves and play these little sort of, camera tricks where they'd be at opposite sides of the room and then move slowly together. And just that image of Arnold and Jesse separating, the night of Arnold's guilty pleas is such a remarkable thing for them to have done, on their own, to have painted that picture themselves.
Elaine, Teddy, Arnie.
Number 4753206.
Please don't kill me.
Mailed, received.
David, I told you, I don't want to be on tape.
Again, Elaine is the only one who has any problem with the video camera being present.
There's an interesting moment that didn't make it into the final cut where this woman that's sitting next to Arnold and Arnold are talking. She's an old friend of the family. And David comes over and he's talking about how it was Elaine who forced Arnold to plead guilty and that she was the only one that wanted him to plead guilty. And this woman looks at David and she says, well, wait a minute. I was just talking to your father and he said that he wanted to plead guilty. He said that he made that decision. And David immediately dismisses that and he says, no, it was my mother's idea. So, he doesn't even believe his father, I think, when his father volunteers that information. I think David is so adamant that it's his mother's fault.
The sentence, 10 to 30 years. The crime, sodomizing young boys. Defendant Arnold Friedman had pleaded guilty to sexually abusing more than a dozen youngsters. But this does not end the Friedman case. There are still numerous sodomy and sex abuse charges pending against Arnold's son, Jesse Friedman.
Now, I think at this stage in the case, Jesse is really completely on his own. And it's really quite a sad moment. I mean, I think people have, in talking to me about it, sort of tried to simplify it and said, well, Arnold didn't care about Jesse. He just left him in the lurch, and Arnold should have made a deal to save Jesse. Clearly, that deal was not offered to Arnold. I spoke to Joe Honorato, the assistant district attorney, about it, and I said, did you ever offer him a deal? And he said, no, we didn't need to offer him a deal because we knew we had him on the child pornography, and, he was going to jail, and, you don't offer them a deal unless you really need to offer them a deal. But nevertheless, Arnold's guilty plea, I think, which came, partly as a result of Arnold's own feelings of guilt about things that he had done in his life, obviously was something that had a tremendous impact on Jesse and did leave Jesse on his own to try to decide his own fate. And, also his father wasn't there for him. His father wasn't there to consult with him, and he didn't have much in terms of a kind of brain trust to draw on.
Some people have commented on the fact that we show that Peter Panero's office is a few doors down the strip mall from the tattoo parlor, but I have to say that I don't think that was much of a commentary on anything other than that, it's important that we not get the impression that Jesse was represented by Milbank and Tweed. Jesse found Peter on his own. He didn't have all the money in the world, and he was trying to put together the best defense that he could.
Not one kid tells his mother or father what happened in class. Not one kid says anything. I find that so incredible that Jesse's story that nothing happened to me was more believable than the police version of these horrific acts.
I think Peter tried very hard to do a good job for Jesse. I think it's easy to second-guess the lawyers now or say that the Friedmans had bad lawyers. I mean, Peter's obviously a smart guy who was faced with an almost impossible challenge here. And, I think he went through tremendous changes in his feelings, on the one hand wanting to save Jesse and seeing that Jesse had a chance of being saved. And, on the other hand, realizing that, there were some realities that he was going to have to deal with, and that the fantasy scenario of helping Jesse walk out a free man was going to be very difficult to achieve, particularly in light of Arnold's guilty plea and some of the other information that was developing.
Jesse was out in the waiting room at this point, and this man had this little boy in there who was a son or a stepson, I don't know.
Now, Peter's story about Arnold in the visiting room, that also seems to split a lot of the audience members. Some people really just believe it completely, and there are others that just can't possibly believe that Arnold would say something that would be so detrimental.
Well, clearly, if Arnold did say it to Peter, it was just an incredible lapse in judgment because, presumably his job at that moment would have been to give Peter a sense of confidence that the young man that he was representing and planned on taking to trial was, a reasonable person who was telling the truth and, didn't come from a family that was completely morally bankrupt, and suddenly Peter finds Arnold saying this thing about this boy bouncing on his father's knee. I mean, I think that was so shocking to Peter, if true. I mean, on the other hand, I guess you could say that maybe that was something that Peter recollected because, I don't know, maybe it made it easier for him somehow to plead Jesse guilty or something like that. But I tend to think that it didn't get made up out of whole cloth.
Imagine it would be somewhat unnerving.
He told me that that he was a pedophile. He told me that he had activity with boys, but not in Great Neck.
We went back to this little community in Wading River and took a camera and wandered around, and we actually found the original Friedman cabin, the place that they used to rent and go for vacations. It still is exactly the same community it was back then, and I actually had found out the names of the boys who had been molested by Arnold, who Arnold had admitted to molesting. And I was walking around with this camera, and a woman came out and asked what we were doing, and we said we were making a film, and she suggested that we go and get permission, which I guess we hadn't done at that point because we were just sort of wandering. And And so we met her and we asked her name, and I immediately recognized the name, and I realized I was talking to the woman who was the mother of one of the boys who Arnold had molested.
I sexually aroused? What the fuck is he talking about? Maybe he put his arm around the kid.
This is kind of the height of David's denial. He's, faced with Arnold admitting something in very clear language, and it's just impossible for him to wrap his brain around it.
It's certainly my hope that one of the impacts of the film is that it can kind of sort of loosen up some of the tightly wound bolts in terms of people's recollections and their feelings and the efforts they've made to change their thoughts or their memories over time. I think until David saw the film, it didn't occur to him that the audience could potentially see some gray area, that I think, they could imagine that Arnold was a pedophile, that Arnold had contact with boys, but that some of the audience members wouldn't necessarily think that Arnold was guilty of the crimes that he was accused of committing. And the same thing with Jesse, for example, that you could believe that Arnold was guilty of certain crimes, but that if those crimes weren't public or didn't happen in the violent way that they were described by the police, that maybe that would have nothing to do with Jesse. It wouldn't have any implications for Jesse at all. And that's something I think that David began to see when he saw the film with an audience for the first time. And so today he's a little bit more moderate on some of these issues because he appreciates the fact that the audience takes away their own feelings and that they don't all necessarily mirror the exact same accusations that were made at the time.
This is kind of an amazing photograph of the father and son, handcuffed together.
So now we're back to David's clown life in New York, and I have to say this is footage that came from the original clown movie. The idea was to sort of start the movie with David, just his feet, just his one blue and one red shoe, kind of wandering around Manhattan on his way to a clown affair, and then eventually we'd sort of pan up and figure out who we were dealing with. But later, of course, that part of David's life, continued to fit into the story in a way, because this is something that's current in his life, and this is what he's been doing for a living for so many years, and this is his personality. So I felt having some of that, in the film today was really important.
And how he balances these different aspects of his life.
Yeah, David describes having, a parent on the telephone talking about the time for their children's birthday party and then getting a phone call from his brother in jail on the other line. And he says just the contrast of these two things is just overwhelming to him. Now, this is amazing to me. I mean, this gives you a sense of how different Jesse Friedman is from your average imprisoned child molester. This is a guy who's intelligent. He's an intellectual. He reads. He's very thoughtful and articulate. And also, what other violent sexual predator are we aware of who has the presence of mind and the ability to use this computer technology to build a computerized database to analyze the sodomy charges against him for their plausibility? He's just a really remarkable person. And this also shows how powerfully Jesse was fighting and how much he intended to go to trial, because this was something that took a tremendous amount of work and was obviously designed to take into a trial and make a case with.
So now we're getting into sort of the heart of how the investigation was conducted, and many of the other cases that sprang up in the late 80s came unraveled when it became public just how the investigations were conducted.
Well, certainly this case, which is more complicated in some ways than some of those cases, had a lot in common with those cases, But I was in Switzerland recently, and somebody had seen the film at the Locarno Festival, and came up to me afterward and said, sort of trying to grapple with the film and what he had just seen. He said in this broken English, he said, "So it is kind of like the Salem witch trials, no?" And I said, "Well, yeah, but in this case, at least one of the people involved was at least partly a witch." there's a tremendous amount in this case that, by today's standards can be analyzed totally differently than probably at the time. Here you have Lloyd Dotman, this bright and well-spoken detective who was in the sex crimes unit and had obviously been properly trained. I can only imagine what he was thinking when he was sitting in the screening of this film at the Tribeca Film Festival and watched one of his partners, Tony Squelia, say, when you talk to a lot of kids, you don't give them much of an option, really. I think that there was a tremendous disparity between the way that a detective like Squelia was interviewing the kids and a detective like Dotman.
If you talk to a lot of children, you don't give them an option, really. You be pretty honest with them. You have to tell them pretty honestly that we know you went to Mr. Friedman's class. We know how many times you've been to the class. We go through the whole routine. We know that there was a good chance that he touched you or Jesse touched you or somebody in that family touched you in a very inappropriate way.
In another part of my interview with Tony Squelia, that detective, he really went into some much greater detail about other kinds of things they would do with the kids and how they would sometimes have to go back to the same child's house 5 or 6 times. Another one of the investigators told me she had to go back sometimes 9 or 10 times. And I said, well, how can you be sure that the first 9 times when the child said that they were not abused or didn't have any recollection of being abused, that was incorrect, but then the 10th time that was suddenly correct? How did you know which was the true story? And essentially they said, when you talk to a lot of kids, you get a sense of what's true and what's not. But this idea of going back to the same child 9 or 10 times is something that, by today's standards, I think is a little bit harder to base a case on.
I mean, I don't want to say I'm a perjurer or anything, but I did not observe anything like that happening.
So what I do remember is the detectives putting on me a lot of pressure to speak up. And at some point, I kind of broke down. I started crying. And when I started to tell them things, I was telling myself that it's not true. Like I was telling myself, just say this to them in order to get them off your back.
This was the document that first got Debbie Nathan interested in the case. She said that initially when she heard about it, it was just too messy to get involved with, given the fact that Arnold was an admitted pedophile. But when she came upon this document and read about so many of the kids not remembering the abuse, it really piqued her curiosity.
Now, the 2 doctors that were responsible for putting the document together, Dr. Kaplan, Sandra Kaplan, and Dr. David Pelkovitz at the North Shore Hospital, were a difficult part of the film. I felt strongly that we needed to interview them because I thought that they were likely to have been influential in terms of helping the children remember the abuse. Certainly hearing from those therapists who had spoken with the Friedman kids before some of them testified, after some of them testified. This boy who talks about being hypnotized is one of the boys who went to therapy at one time or another. So the therapists seemed very important to me, and they agreed originally to be in the film, and we went out there with a crew and sat in the waiting room at North Shore Hospital, and after about an hour we were told to go home and that they had decided they didn't want to be in the film. And one of the reasons that they gave for not wanting to be in the film is that they said that it might compromise their confidentiality and it might be something that would upset their patients because it would indicate that they were therapists who were involved in the Friedman case, and that was something that was not public. And then I faxed them a bunch of articles in which they had clearly taken credit for participating in the case, and that Dr. Kaplan had said many things in relation to the Friedman case. And, after I showed that to them, they said, well, that's right, you might be right, but we still don't want to be in the film. So I got the feeling that their reasons for not being in the film didn't have to do with that at all.
I was told that if he went to trial, the judge would give 3 consecutive sentences. Instead of concurrent, the sentencing would be consecutive. I said, oh my God.
What Elaine's talking about there is the judge's repeated comments to Peter Panaro and others that she intended to give Jesse consecutive sentencing. In other words, if Jesse were convicted of only 3 charges that carried 15-year sentences, that he would go to jail for 45 years under her sentencing. This is very disturbing because obviously it figured into Jesse's decision to plead guilty once he knew that the judge had already said that if he stood in front of her in a court and he was found guilty, that he was going to get really the maximum penalty that could be imagined. So Jesse, at the age of 19, might be going to jail for many more years than he had been alive to begin with.
Oh, fuck. I don't care about my mother, that's for sure.
This was one of the more painful and intimate pieces of footage. We were worried that David wasn't going to allow us to use this, but ultimately he didn't have any objections. He makes a number of predictions here that turn out to be surprisingly accurate, namely that his father's going to kill himself, Jesse's going to go to jail for a very long time, and that Seth is going to move to the West Coast.
You know, Debbie Nathan talks in the film about the McMartin case, and there were other cases going on at the same time. Kelly Michaels, a New Jersey daycare worker, had been sentenced to about 46 years in prison for crimes that were not really as serious as the crimes that Jesse was being accused of. And so at the time that Jesse pled guilty, I think he had no idea these cases were later going to unravel or be seen as, the result of an overzealous prosecution or a hysterical community. I think Jesse very legitimately felt that he too would go to jail for a very long time.
I don't work out deals for people who are innocent. And my first reaction was, I'm not going to do it.
I think people are very interested in this section of the film because there's such a distinct contrast between Peter Pinero's recollection of his conversations with Jesse and Jesse's recollection.
Somebody referred to it as a duel between Peter and Jesse.
Well, Peter's very adamant that, he never would have pled Jesse guilty if he hadn't felt that he was guilty and if Jesse hadn't told him that he's guilty. But I've gone around on this with Peter before, and I've said, so Jesse told you he was guilty at this point, and he said yes. And I said, well, how did he say that? And he said, Peter, I can admit it. And I said, well, is that the same thing as Peter, I did it? And he thinks for a minute, and he says, well, I never would have pled him guilty if he hadn't told me he was guilty. So it's one of those truths that doesn't necessarily have an end point.
When we were making the film, for most of that time, Jesse was in prison, and he was very anxious for us to reach out and locate as many of the former computer students as we could find, because he was confident that once we found them and talked to them, that a number of them would recant their stories, which is exactly what ended up happening.
While I always maintained a healthy skepticism about what anyone in the film told me, Jesse included, it gave me a lot of confidence that Jesse was so adamant about our trying to find out as much as we could, and he never seemed to me to be afraid of anything that we would uncover in our investigation.
Another point that people seem very interested in is this issue of whether Arnold molested Jesse, just distinct from Jesse's guilt or innocence, and everybody kind of wants to get to the bottom of that matter, and there's a lot of conflicting information on that one as well.
I think today Jesse's quite adamant about saying that he never had that kind of relationship with his father, and that it just wasn't a part of that relationship, that could even be a possibility. But I think also if you push Jesse hard enough, he's smart enough to say, well, look, I was 7 or 8 years old, and would I even remember?
I just ran out of options.
This is one of my favorite pieces of music in the film. I think it really is, it's the emotional core of the film for me. This is, the moment when the family has really failed in protecting the youngest child.
We had thought about many different kinds of music for the film, and we had tried a couple of composers, and we didn't really find a solution that we felt emotionally was able to match the power of the images that the Friedmans had shared with us. And I was living in Italy at the time when Richard and I were working on the post-production, and I, through a friend of Richard's, had met Andrea Morricone, the son of Ennio Morricone, who's maybe the greatest cinema composer of all time, and his son is just a brilliant musician and conductor and composer, and his English is pretty good. We sat in his place in Rome, and I played him a very scratchy videotape of the film, and he just immediately locked into it, and he obviously really understood the film. Whether it was through the words or the images, he really had a remarkable beat on it. And we agreed to work together and collaborated between New York and Rome, and ultimately ended up recording the music in Rome, conducted by Andrea.
We're trying to help Jesse pack his last night in freedom, and I wish you would help.
This was the first tape of the Friedman home video that they had shared with us. But before they had decided to give us the footage to use, they wanted to just show us a piece of it just so we could get a sense of what they had. And I remember very clearly the reaction to it that we all had, which was just that we really were dying to get our hands on this footage because it was unlike anything we had seen, and we knew that it would elevate the film to a completely different level.
Okay, Jess, we're on.
Ta-da! I feel like shit.
What's today's date?
Today is the day before I went to jail.
Went to jail?
You know, I have grown up in a household where there were 3 boys, in the suburbs of New York City, and for some reason this material really connected with me, because just the idea of 3 boys staying up all night the night before the youngest brother is going to prison, and the fact that the boys just choose to stay up all night essentially to say goodbye to their youngest brother is just such an intensely sad and emotionally powerful thing to watch. So this tape, which we called Jesse's Last Night, was really the first thing that we saw, but in a way it just informed all the decisions that we made about how to use those home videos.
And the tape, it was a 2-hour tape, standard VHS length, and we felt that you could almost, release it uncut. It just had a natural beginning, middle, and an end, and it was just incredibly compelling.
One of the reasons we included some more of this on the DVD is just because it's fascinating to watch Jesse describe his situation, to see somebody who's inside such a powerful situation of jeopardy, being able to explain themselves and being able to explain the kind of thinking that went into the guilty plea. He talks about, the idea that if the trial took place 3 years later, he could win, but that if they went to trial at that moment in Nassau County, he would lose the trial. And you just are with him at that moment. And, he wakes up the next morning and, he's listening to his favorite James Taylor piece, Carolina on My Mind, preparing himself to go off, brushing his hair, getting ready to walk out the door and get in the car and drive himself off to what will, ultimately be his destination for many years. He'll never be back in that house, ever. By the time he gets out of jail, that house will have been sold. His mother won't even live in Long Island anymore. His father will be dead.
I'm proud to say I've managed to leave barely any gas in the car.
Oh, yeah. Just so like we'll be trapped at the house. We'll run out of gas at the house.
This drive to the courthouse is interesting because, again, I think, the boys are kind of clowning around, and I think some people say, well, this is an example of them being cavalier and not taking the issue seriously. But, for me, it just seems like this whole morning of Jesse's plea is just a classic example of, what they call gallows humor. I mean, the situation couldn't be more serious. Obviously they were quite serious the night before when they stayed up and talked very deeply and intensely and emotionally about the case. But by the time the next morning rolls around and Jesse's dealing with, the impending moment of his plea, I think they just had to find a way to distract themselves. Galasso says that they're dancing and singing on the courthouse steps. Again, I think that gives you a sense that they didn't care or that they weren't remorseful. Well, the Friedman boys would say, well, what, we weren't guilty. What did we have to be remorseful about? We were certainly sad, and our way of dealing with it was to do what we always did, which is to joke around and try to have, some normal moments together and try to remember what it was like before all this happened.
I wish there was something I could have done. I'm really... I'm just so sorry it happened.
This moment in which Jesse's standing in front of Judge Bachlin actually takes place about 6 or 7 weeks later, after Jesse has been in solitary confinement for that whole period. he obviously is able to tap into a lot of emotion at that moment. He's pointed out that he hadn't been out of a cell for a long time, and that plea in front of the judge was the first time he was sort of out in public after having been locked up for a while, and in preparation for going to his next destination, which would be a penitentiary.
Jesse never expressed any kind of sympathy for these kids. And as a matter of fact, on the day that the plea was taken, Jesse was dancing and singing on the courthouse steps.
Now, this footage is very interesting because, it's one of the few pieces of family home video that anyone else was a part of in any way. Fran Galasso and Joe Honorato both described looking out the window of the courthouse and seeing the boys clowning around on the steps of the courthouse. And then because the footage exists and because David shared it with us, we were able to show that footage. And it really shows such a remarkable difference in perspective. It's certainly understandable that the police were looking out the window thinking this was a very strange occurrence, that Jesse was about to go to jail for 18 years and that they were playing around. Of course, David says it was about distracting themselves from what was really going on. But it's interesting that this footage exists, and I think for the first time when we showed the film at the Tribeca Festival and Fran Galasso was there and Joe Honorato was there, I think that was the first time they ever saw what that videotape looked like. And so they had just seen it from a totally different perspective. They had seen it from behind the glass, and suddenly they were right there with the Friedman boys, kind of roughhousing on the courthouse steps, and they were seeing what that was really like. And I think I got a lot out of that. I just felt like it was so healthy for the police to see the boys not through the glass window and just imagine what was going on, but to really see them up close and to see the humanity of these boys and what they were like in real life.
Go ask them, Jess.
This moment, no matter how many times I've seen it, still shocks me. It's like there is a certain disconnect with the way that the boys deal with, the reality of what's going on in the community and the depth of the rage. And here it just, it comes smack right to them, and it's really just kind of an amazing piece of footage.
I think what was going on here is that the boys were, they had a video camera that they had with them, obviously since the night before, and they had, committed to memorializing the whole morning. And among other things, they sort of snuck it into through the metal detector, or they tried to sneak it into the courthouse. And they saw the parents there who had been meeting with Dennis Dillon, the district attorney, trying to increase Jesse's sentence. And I think they just couldn't contain themselves, and they just had to try to film that. And of course, they were noticed by one of the parents, one of the fathers, who just attacked them. And it's really, for me, it's the only moment in the film when you really see the family and the community connect, and the anger and hysterical rage on both sides, I think, finally comes to a head, and it's just suddenly realized in that one moment.
I think both in the editing and in the choice of music and the musical pieces, we tried to build the film like any dramatic film. I think we didn't think to ourselves, well, it's a documentary and therefore it needs to, follow this structure that's based on, historical information or putting it in the context of other cases like this. We knew that this was a film about the family. It wasn't a film about a phenomenon, or it wasn't a film about a period in American history. It was a film about a family, and that's really a timeless subject and something that people relate to at so many levels. And I think that was important to develop through the editing and through the music a real dramatic arc that gave people stakes in the characters, gave them a sense of how those characters were evolving, gave us a sense of the kind of jeopardy the characters were in, and then took it through this resolution, such as it was.
Because he had this insurance policy he had taken out. I think it was $250,000, $250,000, and Jesse was the beneficiary.
There's still a bunch of debate in the family about our interpretation of this. It seems fairly clear that Arnold took an overdose of his antidepressant medication, and that was enough to give him heart failure. And so when David says at the beginning of the film that my father died of a heart attack, he's not entirely wrong. But the fact that it was probably a self-induced heart attack is not something that David has been able to come to terms with, I think, even to this day. I've spoken to David about it, and he says, well, it really doesn't matter what the medical examiner report says. I don't think my father would have taken his own life. Arnold wrote a letter from prison right before he died that really can only be described as a suicide letter or a goodbye letter. In the letter, he talks about suggesting that David transfer his New York Times subscription to Jesse, and he talks about other things that give you the sense that he's trying to close things up.
Let me make you smile. It's unbelievably difficult. I have to read these horrible letters about my brother being almost killed in prison.
This was always one of our favorite pieces of footage, just for the sound that David was making as he was tapping on the keys with the headphones on, and also just getting more of a sense of what his existence was like at home.
This magic poster, which is one of David's collection of magician posters, was amazing. Just having these little devilish children sort of piled on the magician's hand and causing all kinds of problems. It seemed like something that went back to some of the issues of the case.
I feel I will never really know the truth. But
Now, many, many people have asked us after screenings why we waited until the very end of the film to reveal in such a dramatic way that Howard was gay. And that was certainly not our intention, although it always gets a response.
Howard hadn't talked about his homosexuality in his interview. We knew that Howard was gay. He didn't raise it, and we didn't really get into it. And then we went out to Oregon to interview him, and I interviewed him for a very long time, and it wasn't until the end of the interview that he invited Jack to join him on the sofa and to say a few words about the case. And Jack really just says a very few words. He'd been Howard's partner for many, many years, so he was experienced with all these issues. And he just had a few minutes of dialogue about it, and that's where it occurred chronologically, was at the end of Howard's interview, so that's where we placed it.
This piece of music is the main theme to the film, and this is actually the first piece that Andrea played for us when he was working things out early after he came onto the project. And I remember after he played the first 4 notes of this piece, Andrew and I just felt like we knew then that he got it emotionally and that the music for the film was going to be really amazing. I think our hope with the film all along was to give people a very compressed version of what our experience was like making the film.
Yeah, there was so much discovery that happened as we were making the film. Obviously, the first of the discoveries was when we realized that the film wasn't going to be about professional children's birthday party clowns anymore. But after that, the discoveries kept coming. I would be out interviewing somebody in upstate New York or in Oregon or overseas, and at the same time, Jennifer Rogan, our associate producer, would be in the office in New York locating some long-lost photographs from the police files, and Richard would be putting it all together in the editing studio, and I would call Richard and I would say, "How was your day? You're never going to believe what I found out today." And we'd add another piece to the puzzle.
Since the film has come out, actually, Mona, the dachshund, has passed away. And I was sitting next to Howard at the Sundance premiere of the film. And he was fairly emotional straight through the film. But when we got to the part about Mona, he just was totally broken up about it. And he said that he missed the dog so much he just couldn't bear to see her in the film.
To stare at Arnold across the dinner table, and it was just the two of us. there was really nothing between us except these children that we yelled at.
I think a lot of people felt somewhat relieved that Elaine found some peace at the end of the film.
Well, Elaine's husband, Peter, is a really remarkable guy. I think he's a veteran of every 12-step program there is, and I got the feeling that when they got together, Elaine said, "Oh my God, have I got a story for you?" And he said, "Oh, I've heard it before. I had one of those. Sure, I've been there."
It's personal.
I think Jesse is the one who wrote Arnold's epitaph, if I'm not mistaken.
And he had never seen the tombstone.
I think Jesse ended up getting out of prison to go to Arnold's funeral. And we don't have any photographs of it, but I think that Jesse went to the funeral in handcuffs, and he was given special permission to leave prison for that.
How you doing? Oh my God. Oh my God. Oy, oy, oy.
Now, this has to be one of the best examples of truth being stranger than fiction. People have said the idea that when Elaine finally sees Jesse, she slams the door in his face a couple of times is, really unusual. We had written that in the script. I don't think it would have passed the editors. But, for me, it really gives a sense of how split Elaine is. Of course she loves her son. Of course she misses him tremendously. But at the same time, she's closed the door to this part of her life for many years. And suddenly, Jesse's back.
And it's going to get a lot more complicated.
The jazz boom mambo with boogie beat is the newest dance on 50